Hello and welcome to another episode in my podcast series on the Russo-Ukraine war. Now, this episode, as mentioned in my last one, will talk about the political situation in Ukraine. The reason we're starting there is because the war is being fought there, and because for that reason, Ukraine would, under normal circumstances, have a very strong territorial and defense advantage. Now, it's also important in terms of understanding what other people's geopolitical interests are in this conflict, to start with what the overall situation is in Ukraine. And the fact is, it has been a country more or less constantly in crisis since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Now, in this particular episode, I'm not going to go through the whole history of how things sort of ended up in this situation. That would take me probably many hours. But I am going to go over a very basic overview of the situation just before the Maidan revolution, as well as the situation today. I believe that despite polling shifts since Maidan, I think what you see is a lot of papering over of difficulties in coexisting and an inability of people to come together in the state to solve joint problems and build a common culture through common cause. Now, what we have to understand is, at the time of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Ukraine consisted of what has been effectively Ukraine post-2014, plus the autonomous Republic of Crimea, which has been an autonomous republic within the framework of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. So even in USSR days, at the end of the USSR, Crimea was an autonomous union, an autonomous region within the greater Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. This is actually really important as we get out further. But the result has been a lot of tension between Crimea and the overall state of Ukraine. And this is part of the reason why the question of Crimea's status going forward is something which is complicated. But before I go through sort of the situation today, as well as, no, never mind. I was going to start with thoughts on what would be required for just peace for Ukrainian perspectives, but I think it would be better to talk about the problems that Ukraine has first, the divisions within Ukraine, and then from there it becomes a little easier to talk about a just peace. Now, like Russia in the 1990s, Ukraine became an extremely corrupt state. Just as Yeltsin basically sold off all of the heavy industry in Russia to a handful of individuals, same thing happened in Ukraine. These are the folks, of course, that we call oligarchs. And they're just a handful of them, they own everything. Ukraine never had a strong anti-oligarch political figure who could actually work with the strength to make these things change. And as a result, you still very much have an oligarch-led economy and an oligarch state. And it's an extremely corrupt state. So this is the first thing. And if you look at election after election after election, revolution after color revolution, one constant that you see is you see that the Ukrainian people are fed up with the degree of corruption and dysfunction within their own state. And they want something better. How to get something better is a harder question. As I was saying, figuring out how to get something better is a harder problem. And in this regard, Ukraine is a very divided country. You've had what have been sort of the national stronghold in Lviv, which extends through Kiev and towards the and then south from there. And then you've had a much more Russian sympathetic area east of the Dnieper and in the very far south. In these areas, people tend to speak different languages or have spoken different languages as their primary languages at home. The majority in the east and the south, before Maidan, spoke Russian at home, and the majority in the northeast spoke Ukrainian at home. A large portion of people in the northeast have tended to think that if Ukraine could develop closer ties with the EU would force Ukrainian government structures to become less corrupt. That the easiest way to clear up the corruption is to join the EU. Now, interestingly enough, the far right in Ukraine has not been terribly warm on EU membership. The particularly far right groups like the Social Nationalist Association, or Social National Assembly, or the National Corps, I guess is the current successor organization to that, have been anti-EU membership, anti-NATO, as well as anti-Russian. But for a very large portion of people in the northwest, the EU has been sort of the direction that is looked for the salvation of the country. In the south and the east, south and the west, south and east, it's a little different. It's people are not very warm towards the EU. They certainly agree that the corruption's a problem, but that's about as far as the agreement goes. So that's one large division. Then you have the Crimean issue. As I say, Crimea has been an autonomous republic within Ukraine since before Ukraine was an independent state. And Crimea also is probably the largest ethnic Russian enclave within the de jure Ukrainian state today. Now, east and west, the north, west, and the whole rest of and the rest of Ukraine differ on other really important things as well. The two areas have very different ways of looking at their history in the Soviet Union. They have very different ways of looking at World War II. They have very different ways of looking at not only the way forward, but the past. Was the Great Patriotic War a Great Patriotic War, or was it just another excuse to beat up on Ukrainian nationalism? And that's something which, as I say, depends very much on your perspective. One thing that we have a tendency of thinking very much in sort of the great powers of, in terms of World War II, is that World War II was this morally unambiguous war. The Germans were so bad, and therefore any opposition to them is justified. But for a lot of people caught in the middle of this conflict, it's a lot more nuanced than that. Poland was invaded both by the Germans and by the Russians, and when called upon their mutual defense treaties, were told, oh, well, those only apply to the German invasion, we don't care about the Russian invasion. Poles thus have a very complicated relationship with World War II, and this is part of the reason why Polish collaboration with the Nazis and participation in the Holocaust is such a sensitive such a sensitive issue in Poland. Primarily because, there were these issues of, domination of their country. And by the way, this is a really good example of something I said last time, which was that coexistence has to be the goal. And certainly, Germany wasn't interested in coexisting, and I don't think the USSR at that point was very interested in coexisting either, for historical reasons that are way beyond the scope of this post or this item, this podcast. And consequently, a lot of people were put into very difficult positions. And while Ukrainian nationalists tend to point the finger at the USSR and say, oh, they were bad guys too, but, the US and England, they were good guys. If you look at, for example, Indonesian experiences in World War II, the British and the Americans were definitely not good guys. Japanese weren't either, but in some respects, the Americans and British were actually worse. So, to understand and build sympathy, we have to get away from this idea that World War II was a morally unambiguous war with pure good guys and pure bad guys. In fact, war is almost never about good guys and bad guys, it's about bad guys and worse guys. So, and in some cases, people who might be the lesser evil in some respects might be the greater evil to certain groups of people affected by the conflict. And we need to understand that and express some sympathy with it. So, where I was going with this is it's necessary then to ask the question of how can all these groups coexist in Ukraine together? And that's the question we have to be asking ourselves. Obviously, the groundwork and the agreements have to be made by Ukrainians, whether from the east or from the west. But the end result has to be one of coexistence. And those of us who are supplying weapons to Ukraine need to be aware that the end goal has to be coexistence, because if it isn't, then we're going to get something very bad for everybody out of this conflict. The ultra-nationalist wings of Ukraine are, as I mentioned before, concentrated in the north and west of the country. If Russia were to carve out into a separate state or Russian territory, those areas where people had, up until 2014, majority spoken Russian or similarly had much more pro-Russian sentiments, what that would do is that would rob the Ukrainian discussion of what it means to share a nation together of those voices. And in fact, this is what Russia's been doing by carving out Ukraine and Donbass. What this has meant is that the large ethnic Russian enclaves within Ukraine have been cut out of the political discussions of Ukraine itself. My great fear is that if we don't understand that the core piece of a just peace is going to have to involve making sure that the Russian-leaning voices, including those who are currently pro-LPR and pro-DPR, are part of the new state, then you can't have that coexistence. If you don't have that coexistence, my fear is that Ukraine will become a very, very, very radicalized, very right-wing state, which will pose a menace to Europe, to Russia, and frankly to the United States, even as far as, even to countries as far away as Australia and New Zealand. One of the big problems that you have here is that this crisis in 2014 led to the beginnings of a civil war with Donbass, the Donbass areas, Donetsk and Luhansk, declaring autonomy, which is not quite the same as independence, and being violently opposed by the central government. And in fact, today, a whole lot of the foot soldiers on both sides are people who are from Ukraine. Russia's supporting one side in a civil war with massive artillery and massive armor, and to great effect. But this is still a war between Ukrainians to a very large extent. And if we can't find ways of coming together, then what hope is there? You know, Zelensky was elected, we should not forget, to resolve the civil war. And for years he tried. One of the things that gave a real problem was that the army would not respect the orders for ceasefires. Now, in this case, you have a country which is very much a country in crisis. If it weren't a country in crisis, there wouldn't be they wouldn't be struggling to hold their own in this war, and frankly not holding their own. They would have been holding their own fairly easily. But these crises are these crises make it very difficult for the country to hold together. Yet, as I've mentioned before, the critical outcome here is making sure that the Ukrainian state has these diverse voices, the pro-Russian voices, the pro-Western voices, the voices from Crimea, the voices from from the areas where the Luhansk People's Republic has been strong. All these voices have to come together and work together in whatever state we get out of this. And if they can't, if this continues to be a fight over what language people can use in shops, or what language people can get their kids educated in, or whether Victory Day can be celebrated, or things like that, then you're not going to have coexistence. All you're going to have is a culture war through the state. And as long as you only have that, then it's inevitable that eventually you'll have violence like we have today. So this is one of the key things here. Territorial integrity isn't there for territorial integrity's just for the sake of territorial integrity. The reason why Ukraine needs territorial integrity coming out of this war is because if Ukraine doesn't have that territorial integrity, then the country will be a very different country going forward from a political composition perspective. And I think that would be a very bad thing. Now, as I said before, I will be criticizing all sides in this in a humane manner. This one is about Ukraine because the war is being fought there, and so we have to start there. In my next episode, I plan to talk about Russian perspectives, both where Russia has some valid interests, but also how Russia is making all these problems a whole lot worse. And I'm sure I will be at least as critical of their side as well. I think that, as I say, we have to think about how can all of this come together in a way that allows for coexistence at the end of the day. So if we can't coexist, then what's the point? You know, Ukrainians in the East have to coexist with Ukrainians in the West. Ukraine has to coexist with Russia. Ukraine has to coexist with Europe. Europe has to coexist with Russia. Russia has to coexist with the US and vice versa. And the world as a whole is made richer by our differences, including deeply held differences of opinion. So the path towards a just peace has to be to recognize that. At any rate, that's all for this episode. Next time I'll be talking about sort of the Russian influence and the Russian side, and how the actions by Russia since 2014 have been making the crises in Ukraine significantly worse. Thank you very much, and have a great week.